Dr. Jordan Peterson recently appeared before the House Committee on the Weaponization of Government to talk about the issue of debanking. Now, this is a very interesting hearing with a lot of fireworks in some cases, but also a lot of insight, including a lot of I think, philosophic and deep insight that Congress normally does not get due to the cultures of mediocrity that actually exist in the halls of power. We'll talk about that in a second. That I think that they could benefit to if they actually listen to what Dr. Peterson had to say. So we're going to actually play a few clips from this hearing to go over what Dr. Peterson said, but then I'm going to go and try to diagnose the source and the basis of the problems that he's talking about. So first, Dr. Peterson talks about, in his opening statement, how this atmosphere of technological supremacy that is around us in terms of the data that's collected on us, in terms of the fact that everything that we do online is profiled in some way, and also in terms of the fact that the government and financial corporations and big tech collaborate with each other, all threaten individual liberty and the freedom of society. And he gives an example of the Chinese social credit score. Go.
Is integrated with the so-called Chinese social credit system, which awards its involuntary participants with a score indicating their compliance with the dictates of the Chinese Communist Party, allowing for full control over access to everything they possess electronically. Most ominously, their savings and their access to travel. Certainly all modern means of travel, but increasingly as the electronic gates come up, even by walking. If you're Chinese or a visitor, your access to the world can be reduced to zero if your social credit score falls beyond an arbitrary minimum. This allows you purposefully to be shut out of all activities that can be virtualized. And in a rapidly virtualizing world, this increasingly means all activities: driving, shopping, working, eating, finding shelter, even fraternizing with friends and family, as merely being in the presence of someone with a low social credit score means that your own score can be lowered. This has also opened up the opportunity for the government to extract slave-like labor from its citizens, so burdened, as the donation of free work to the state still constitute one means by which erring Chinese men and women can increase their score and remain part of human society.
Yeah, and then he specifically talks about how the financial institutions collaborated to crush the people that gave money to the Canadian truckers in Canada, because this is actually a very big deal in Canada. There were folks that actually donated money to the Canadian truckers, and they themselves, even if you didn't participate, if you donated money to these people, your bank was taken away from you. Go.
I want you to talk about what took place in Canada and if it in any way impacted you.
Well, there was essentially a working class protest against the extensive length of the COVID lockdowns. And one consequence of that was that Canadians who participated, even by donating to the protest and even by donating small amounts to the protest, had their bank accounts seized in consequence of a collusion between the banks and the government that was extrajudicial, that was recently deemed unconstitutional, despite the fact that we don't have strong First Amendment claims.
And then there was this moment where a congressman criticizes Dr. Peterson and says that the First Amendment is not absolute, and then cites the prevalence of misinformation and disinformation to justify his rather, I think, odd and simplistic claim that a lot of people like to make these days. Go.
Mr. Chairman, you continually say that it used to be that both parties agreed with the First Amendment. It didn't used to be. It is. It remains the case. We all agree with the First Amendment, but the problem is that the First Amendment is not absolute. It does not protect any single thing anyone says, and there are limits, and that's important. And what this committee has been trying to do for the last year and a half is to chill the federal government from monitoring what is going on social media and otherwise out there, so that misinformation and disinformation can run rampant.
Well, we are in quite a bind, aren't we? Before I continue to explain why I think that Dr. Peterson's message is quite prescient, and important for all of us as Americans to focus on, allow me to say a few things. First of all, I am Christian Watson. Thank you so much for listening to me. If you enjoy politics mixed up with philosophical commentary and sometimes social commentary, then I would encourage you to please give a good consideration to subscribing to this channel, to commenting on this video, to sharing. It actually helps me a lot with the algorithm. I want to help bring forth the revolution of the mind in this country, so I appreciate your consideration. Now, this idea about the First Amendment not being absolute. So when conversations about freedom of expression are had in our society, at least in America, we have to understand something. We don't get our rights from the law. Positive law, which is simply laws passed by a government body that say something, if they're going to have any basis of legitimacy to them, have to be based on the natural principle of justice. And in order for justice to have any basis of legitimacy to it, it has to be based on an overarching objective foundation. And that objective foundation is found in natural law, it's found in the nature of things, and it's found in the principles that we deduce from natural law that are necessary for the preservation of human life and, more fundamentally, the preservation and flourishing of society. Without ethics, society cannot flourish or be preserved. It can only fall into this miasma of chaos. So when people say the First Amendment is not absolute, what they're really saying by proxy is that your ability to express yourself needs to be limited by some kind of law. And expression, if we take it in its actual purest form, is absolute. Because when I express myself to the fullest extent of my soul and my conscience, I am fulfilling an important part of my role as a moral agent, and that is as someone who is honest. A society that does not have veracity is a weak and sickly society, and it's a society that will create politicians, will create entrepreneurs and business people and leaders who are also not bound to the truth and will act in a manner that is oftentimes mischievous, malevolent, and will lead to the destruction of good people for no reason. So that's why it's important to have an honest society, because without honesty, society can't really operate. Now, having said that, when you use your expression in an impure way to harm others, then of course that's not absolute. But guess what? That was never a permission given to you in the first place. So I don't like hearing about this First Amendment talk because a lot of it confuses the law with the actual moral justification under the law, and no amount of common law or case law or judicial interpretation can override the fundamental basis for the legitimacy of the Constitution or any law. So yes, the First Amendment, by virtue of being the reflection of expression, is absolute. Anyone that says that it is not absolute is not talking about expression, or at least not talking about it properly. They're talking about something entirely different. It's a category error this guy's making. But also, misinformation and disinformation. I've covered this extensively in my videos. Those are two words used by people, not just to control you, but to get you to think in different ways about the way we process information and the world. Control is one thing. Control is very direct, and it's very hands-on and active. Why would I need to control you if I can get you to think in the terms that produce mediocrity and blind your eyes to truth? If I can get you to believe that any information that goes against the dominant narrative in society, that goes against social institutions that are verified by status and not by merit, if I can get you to believe that anything that is contrary to that which is established is evil and incorrect and bad and attribute it to some mischievous source, whether it be the Russians or the Chinese or whatever, then I can get you to go along with whatever agenda I have in my grasp. That's why Peterson's points in this hearing are so important. Because even if they don't directly control you, if they can frame the way you think, you'll be a useful puppet for them yourselves. So that's a rant for another day. But I tire when I see Congress people acting in such an unprincipled manner and using the faculty of speech to injure rather than to heal and to enlighten as it is meant to. That is an impure use of speech, speaking of impurity. Now, I think there are several reasons why we have the kind of problems Dr. Peterson is talking about. the problems where financial institutions will happily cooperate with the government, the problems where a culture in a society that is so immersed in technology is beginning to be controlled and profiled by technology, and which could eventually in America lead to a system of control that happens informally through society as they have in China. All of these things I think are attributable to a few simple causes. Number one, loss of moral knowledge. I've always said that in the West right now, we have a massive crisis of moral education. Most people cannot tell you or justify what they believe is right or wrong beyond mere sentiment or emotion. Most people cannot tell you or justify what they believe is right or wrong according to some higher principle beyond appealing to the traditions that they've grown up with. Everyone thinks differently and works differently. And for some people, that may be the only way they're able to express moral ideas. But that is not a consequence of their physiology, of them being somehow unintelligent. No. That is a consequence, rather, of a culture and a society that does not pride the advancement of knowledge in terms of the moral sciences. Morality today is not viewed as a science as our founders saw it. Our founders saw ethics and morality as a science, as a process by which you do certain things and you test certain things and you get an objective result as virtue of that test. But today, morality is simply seen as a product of your identity, as a product of your standing in society, or something else that involves you as the center of the moral universe, rather than things that involve things that go beyond you as the center of the moral universe. So in this culture where our moral education is so muted beneath these mediocre concepts, and our institutions also follow these mediocre concepts to the letter, we are going to be more susceptible to the abuses of power by government, to the lies of politicians, and to the encroachments of technological progress upon our moral beings than if we were instead morally educated. So what do I mean? Very simply, my friends, the founding generation of America, they had a very concrete notion of what they believed and why they believed it. And it was that concrete notion that not only allowed them to beat the king and his empire and break the yoke of slavery off of their backs, but also allow them to continue that momentum throughout the years with incidences like the Whiskey Rebellion and the Shays Rebellion, where good-natured people asserted their rights perhaps in a fierce way, perhaps in a grotesque way, but in a way that kept the tree of liberty replenished and furnished with blood, as Jefferson said, in a way that kept authority checked, certainly. But as time marches on, you can't easily do that anymore because people have different ideas about what authority means to them. The Western mind, especially the American mind, has been enslaved by the curse of welfarism post-1920s. The virus of welfarism entered into our systems in the early 20th century, and then after the New Deal ramped up and redefined the private-public sphere, the entire relationship between the individual and American and his society, that was thrown out of the window, and a new conception of government was entered, and that's what people today are laboring under, which is why if you tell someone, I'm going to cut your Social Security, they will have a conniption. They will have a conniption not because you're doing something evil, you're actually doing something that is virtuous, because Social Security is literally fueled off of theft, which makes it evil, but because they have an emotional attachment to an idea of government that is fundamentally incorrect. So the moral education problem in our country feeds directly into what Dr. Peterson is saying. And also, as I mentioned, the shifting of moral paradigms in our country from a sort of objective, rational type of viewpoint based on first principles to a progressive viewpoint based on administration, based on utility, and based on using the government as a tool to achieve your social agenda rather than using the government as a tool to preserve what is universally true. That shift of paradigms has then allowed the government to take liberties with what it will do in terms of its intrusions of society, and that therefore influences what institutions of society will do. When the government bails out people in 2008, that creates a perverse incestuous relationship between the government and certain financial institutions. When the government gives grants to companies and subsidizes them, and those companies happen to be the ones that are taking your data, that also creates a perverse financial incentive and an incestuous relationship between the government and those companies. And when, again, this is multi-layers. There's multiple layers here of understanding that people aren't really getting or don't really wish to understand. And it all goes down to that shifting of moral paradigms. But then status, this is one that's not talked about. Status also puts us in the throes of these various terrors of debanking, of technological tyranny, of social credit. And it does so in a way that many of us may not even realize. Many of us have for a very long time trusted corporations and institutions that have been given the brand of status and validity from general society with the information we consume. A lot of people, even today, not people that are tuned into the internet, but most people, common people, normally so to speak, will look at what ABC News says, and they'll consider what ABC News says more than they'll consider what Tim Pool says or what I say, because ABC News is a so-called major validator. Even though ABC, NBC, and CBS were at the forefront of government propaganda efforts for decades to enslave the American mind to certain notions that allowed the war machine to flourish, that allowed mediocre concepts to flourish, that allowed so many things to happen that were not right for the country and that were certainly morally reprehensible. They were all possible in part, not fully, but in part because the mind was blunted by status. When you can only look at something for what it is close to, or what prestige it has, or what praise it gets in general society, and you ignore its merits, you will be easily led down a path of flawed thinking, and that by itself is flawed. The merits of something have nothing to do with what it is. It has to do with what it says and what it can do. I would never look at a brand new car and say that must run good if I know that brand new car has been wrecked several times and it's then been recalibrated, so to speak, to look better, and it's had all these kind of aesthetic things happen to it. Brand new or not, it's been wrecked, and the contents of the car are messed up, and therefore my life's in danger. But status used to be the center of moral thinking in the old world before America came around. And if you were a king, a noble, or some kind of person anointed by authority, you were considered the one who should have an opinion and no one else. The sort of rule by intellectual aristocracy, which creates mediocrity and suppresses the creative spirits of man and also breeds a tyrannical order. That is what status did in the old world. And it's doing the same thing today, but in a different way, wearing the skin suit of the new world. Notice, these institutions, these news institutions, which manufacture consent, all of them will say, well, we are simply doing the duties of a free press. But if the press is influenced and controlled by those in government, if the press itself is influenced and controlled by narratives that if questioned fall apart, but they don't question them because their existences rely on them, is the press truly free? No, the press is simply a captured lawyer, a captured spokesperson, giving the illusion that he is free to give credibility to his words, when in all reality they have no credibility whatsoever. That's the society of status. Status has blunted the minds of people to looking at what Google is doing with their information. Google has more on you than perhaps you have on yourself. They can predict your patterns, they know what you've searched, all kind of stuff, and yet many people will simply say, Google it, or look at Google, because that has been for years the standard bearer of excellence in internet innovation. The connection between status and flawed thinking, status and intellectual mediocrity is so clear, and yet it's never tested, because it's much easier for us to simply go through life assuming things rather than thinking about things. And so Dr. Peterson's points, a lot of them maybe wouldn't be valid if more people broke the binds of status over their mind and looked at the content of what they're thinking about rather than simply its appearance. The last cause of these problems is the loss of sociability. Now, this is going to be a little bit heady, but pay attention. It's going to be good. Sociability. Okay, so society is based on a single principle. And that principle is sociability. Sociability is the principle that binds society together, and it's rooted in human nature, and it's safeguarded by justice. The more people are factionalized, ignorant, and not appreciative of the requirements of a healthy culture, which I've kind of demonstrated in this entire video here, and they are perpetually distracted, the more sociability atrophies. Sociability is simply what happens when the desire for you as a human being, rooted in your nature, to be a social creature, to organize in society, maybe for your own needs, and also maybe to help others as well, to collaborate with your fellow man, to have fellowship, to have goodwill, all that kind of stuff. It's simply what happens, all those things come together and they materialize in the social context. But if I have no knowledge of that principle, and my view of society is rather filtered through disembodied algorithms, filtered through media perceptions, filtered through mediocre concepts that were not even the case 30 years ago, but are now the case now, then how can I be a sociable person? The challenge of sociability in the digital age is one thing, but the challenge of sociability in a world where so much of our information is polluted and our idea of what a healthy culture is also weighed down by this culture of mass distraction, where reality TV shows and drama have more currency in the culture than philosophy and learning and civics and first principles. In that kind of world, I can't be sociable. I can only interact with a facsimile, this vague idea of what a society actually is, and toy with that idea, and maybe even play with that idea a little bit, but I'll never actually get anything out of it, and I'll never be able to actually participate in it beyond the superficial musings that I might get every once in a while. Sociability, when that atrophies, the new basis for society comes in, because if the basis of society is sociability, and that's gone, what is the new basis of society? A society that is not based on contract and consent, or rather that is not achieved through contract and consent, through what you want to do, through allowing others to partake in your activities with you, but instead is based on manipulation, subversion, distortion, and brute force. When that congressman said that it's important for the government to monitor social media and deal with misinformation, disinformation, he's not promoting a society based on contract and goodwill, or contract and consent. He's proposing a society based fundamentally on brute force, manipulation, subversion, and permission from authority. That is one of the biggest issues that will continue to feed this. Debanking, big tech, all these things, social credit scores, they are simply a symptom of the things I've laid out today. And we should ask ourselves, as Americans, one question. Are we willing to reignite the culture of freedom and rationalism that came to define the greatness of our country? Or will we allow the terrors of authoritarianism, birthed through mediocrity, birthed through unhealthy cultures, birthed through foul notions, birthed through foreign philosophies, to weigh down on the consciousness of our nation and continue to take us into this vast void of darkness that we are currently spiraling down? Let Dr. Peterson's testimony be a testament to the fact that our time is running out, but it need not run out if we as Americans band together and we say, no, our country is worth it, morality is worth it, ethics is worth it, and the general idea of what it means to be an American, the philosophy of Americanism, that's worth it. That's the side I stand on. How about you? My friends, like, share, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. Study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.